One afternoon, a local researcher came into the store to share her time-lapse photos of strange craft photographed over the area in the early morning hours. We talked for about 30 minutes or more about the craft, ascension and trajectory, and possible viewing locations for future sightings before she hurried out the door for another meeting. Just as she was closing the door, another woman, who was already inside and waiting to talk, was introduced to me. She said triangle craft were gliding quietly into the area near her home nightly. As she was on her way out of town for a while, she wanted us to take the keys to her home and asked us to take as much time as we needed to document her reports. When we looked up her home address online, we noticed right away that her home was in the general area of the flight path reported by the researcher, who had just left. We also found statements online regarding underground military installations nearby, in addition to the woman's claim that NASA was coming out the following week to investigate. Sounded like fun to us, so we loaded up our camping gear and hit the road the following afternoon. When we arrived at her home, we noticed that it was situated on the side of a fairly steep hill, so pitching our tents was out of the question. The surrounding trees were also pretty tall and would most likely prevent decent camera footage of incoming craft, so we decided to head for another location about 15 minutes south of her home. We arrived at the campgrounds about 1 hour before sunset and hurried to get everything set up before dark. Our one campsite was actually comprised of 3 adjacent sites, so we were able to spread out and set up various equipment in their own space so as not to get disturbed. It also allowed us to keep the equipment out and ready for when needed at a moment's notice. Just after dinner, and when it was dark enough, everyone gathered together in order to hike up the side of a nearby hill. When we found a small clearing, we all stopped and found a comfortable position to lie on our backs and look up into the night sky. It was while in this location that I felt a presence just up the hill from our group. I wasn't the only one who picked up on this, as one of the 2 dogs also sensed it and became distracted. I didn't hear anything or see anything, however. It was more like sensing when someone is looking at you from a distance. Somehow, you just know when you're being watched. I took the dog and walked about 50 feet further up the hillside, stopping where it felt like someone had just been. The dog looked around nervously and whimpered a few times. I looked around for a fallen tree and decided to sit down for a moment. Looking back toward the rest of the group, I tried to get a feeling of what it was like being quietly observed from this location. I comforted the dog by assuring her it was all right, and a few moments later, we rejoined the group. All the while, I had the feeling someone or something had moved to a point just over the crest of the hill. Fast forwarding about 4 or 5 hours, the 3 girls resigned within their tent a few yards from the fire. Their tent was an open sky model, meaning the roof of the tent was made of a screen fabric similar to the window covering in order to allow occupants to gaze at the stars from within the tent. Around midnight, I was in my tent changing clothes when I heard the girls yell that a UFO was hovering directly over their tent and just above the trees. My tent also had an open sky view, but I was further over in the first campsite and unable to see what they were talking about. By the time I was out of my tent, the craft had moved away and out of sight, being blocked by the tall pine trees that surrounded us. I asked the girls what happened. Evidently, a circular craft hovered briefly over their tent, as if waiting for them to spot it before leaving. Once they saw it and started yelling, the object began to move slowly to their left. This meant it was heading in the direction of the clearing everyone was at earlier to skywatch. They described it as being a black circle craft with red and orange lights rotating around it, with a ring of white lights rotating in the opposite direction within the ring of red/orange lights. None of us adults saw what the children described. For some strange reason, all of us adults were off in different locations and distracted by some task when this happened. For example, I was away from the group and inside my tent putting warmer clothes on. Others were putting things away for the evening, and one person was setting up a telescope in our third campsite. When the girls saw the craft, everyone else was effectively disposed of in remote locations away from the girls' tent. The pine trees were so tall and thick that you couldn't see the sky above another campsite, even if it was the one next to your own. The interesting thing about this whole incident was the direction in which the craft headed once the girls saw it. I hadn't told anyone about my experience of being watched up on the hillside, so it seemed more than coincidental that the craft headed back up the hill toward that spot. A couple of hours later, the children were asleep and the rest of us were once again doing our own thing in various parts of our campsites. Two of us spent some time doing astrophotography with a telescope. When finished, I returned to sit near the fire. This was when I noticed the strange behavior from two of the others. They were talking about something and were very quiet about it. When I asked what was going on, I had no idea the answer was going to keep me up for several more hours. The woman explained that while she was cleaning up dinner items and putting things away a little while earlier, she noticed a strange light. A beam of white light came from the hillside where we were earlier and stopped at her feet. When she looked down at her feet and at the light, she entered into a trance-like state and, without telling any of us, began following the light through the woods and up the hill. As she walked through the woods, she knew she was going to enter a craft and that she would be okay. In fact, she said the light made her feel giddy and safe. Moving further and further up the hill, she said she knew what was about to happen and that she was going to board the craft. She wished the rest of us were with her and could join her in the contact and flight in the UFO. This is when it dawned on her that she was alone. Her motherly instinct also kicked in, as she worried about who would take care of her daughter while she was away. At that moment, she said she yelled out my name, and the light disappeared. The trance was then broken, leaving her to wonder where she was and how to return to our campsite. Still feeling a little foggy, she decided to just head down the hill and look for a road and then our campsites. It was at that point she informed her boyfriend of what happened, and that's also when I arrived at the fire and noticed them talking quietly near their vehicle. After sharing her incredible experience with me, I grabbed a flashlight, my camera, a set of the night vision goggles, and told her to show me where it happened. I wanted to see where the light was coming from. The two of us headed back up the hillside, and in a matter of a minute or two, we had already lost visual sight of our camp. Incredibly, she took me to the location where the dog and I sensed someone observing us. From there, we continued up the hill and to the left. As strange as this may sound, the trees appeared to form a hallway, and she confirmed that was where she was when she broke free of the trance and the light disappeared. We continued up the tree-lined hallway until it stopped, hoping to figure out where they were leading her. Right there in front of us was another amazing sight. A strange circular clearing was made by cutting the trees, and this was located at the top of the hill. We have no idea when it was made or why it was made so far up the hill, but one thing was certain, that was at the end of the hallway of trees she was being led. In fact, she was almost at the end of that hallway when the light disappeared. By the time we reached this clearing, there was no presence of a ship or beings like I observed hours earlier. I said, whatever or whoever was here, they're gone now. We snapped several photographs using the night vision goggles and returned to tell the two other adults what we found. I returned in the morning for daylight photos and to get a better sense of the area. The first thing I'd like to comment on is that once again, everyone in the group was distracted or were otherwise moved to different parts of the campsite to allow for her contact. This is common when a single person needs to be taken from a larger group of people. The second point is that I find it curious that when this woman broke the trance and the light vanished, it was after she called out my name. While this might be nothing more than her intention to not continue, it's actually the second time she had contact with extraterrestrials and called out my name to end it when she became frightened. Briefly, in the first instance, she was indoors with someone else and they were hiding behind a bed mattress. She told me they were coming for her and that she was going to be taken onto a craft. That's when she said to her visitors,
Todd said I don't have to go.
This ended the encounter and they were left behind. They've apparently come for her before. During this camping incident, however, she decided against going onto the craft because she didn't want to leave her daughter behind. That's when she called out my name, as she knew it had stopped them previously.